I'm a high school history teacher, and recently I've been playing the Call of Duty Black Ops series, explaining the historical context for the events of the games. In this video, I'll give Black Ops 6 the same treatment. I've been really excited for this, so without further ado, let's get right into it. Black Ops 6 takes place in early 1991 during the Persian Gulf War as the Soviet Union was collapsing. Before we get into the campaign, let's discuss the context and causes of these massively important events. In Black Ops Cold War, we got to meet Mikhail Gorbachev, then a secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In 1985, Gorbachev became the head of the Soviet Union after the deaths of Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, and Konstantin Chernenko. Gorbachev was the first leader of the Soviet Union who was born after it was founded. Originally from a poor peasant family in the North Caucasus region, Gorbachev had a unique perspective on the Soviet Union. He was a true-believing communist, but he also believed that the Soviet Union needed to give more freedom to its people if it wanted to compete with the United States. In 1949, Radio Free Europe was founded by the National Committee for a Free Europe, a front organization for the CIA. Throughout the Cold War, Radio Free Europe broadcast anti-communist news, information, and analysis to regions under Soviet influence, including Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The people of the Soviet Union couldn't rely on their news stations to provide reliable information. For days after the infamous Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, Soviet news organizations didn't even report on it. People in Eastern Europe tuned in to Radio Free Europe to get life-saving information. On a less dramatic note, Western culture was seeping in through these broadcasts. People in the Soviet Union clamored for Western entertainment, clothing, makeup, cars, music, and so much more. But the communist government didn't let them have access to these things. When Gorbachev came to power, he had the idea that the Soviet Union should open itself up to the West to allow its people more freedom so that they would be happy. In February 1986, Gorbachev made a famous speech to the Communist Party Congress in which he explained that the Soviet Union's economy and political system needed restructuring, or perestroika. He loosened restrictions on foreign trade and investment and allowed some farmers and manufacturers to make their own decisions on what to produce and how much to charge. This was counter to the decades of government control over the economy, which was the foundation of the Soviet system. In addition to perestroika, Gorbachev also made glasnost, or openness, a main point of his reform program. He expanded freedom of the press, allowing publications to poke fun at the failing Soviet system and at the inefficiencies in government. Then, in a move unprecedented since the formation of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev announced that they would now hold truly democratic elections. In 1989, a new parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies, was formed with even more political authority than the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Although Gorbachev was a true-believing communist and tried to maintain control over the economy, his reforms set the stage for the collapse of the Soviet Union as they weakened the Communist Party's control. Gorbachev's reforms significantly affected society within the Soviet Union, but they also signaled to countries under Soviet influence that change was possible. Back in the 1940s, at the end of World War II, people in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and elsewhere unsuccessfully resisted the Soviet Union. In response to the formation of NATO in 1949, the Warsaw Pact, an alliance between the USSR and Eastern European countries, was formed in 1955. That following year, in 1956, an anti-communist revolution began in Budapest, Hungary. Violence broke out between anti-communist militias and the Hungarian state police, and Nikita Khrushchev ordered the Soviet army to put down the revolution. Thousands of people were killed. In 1968, a similar event occurred in Czechoslovakia, known as the Prague Spring. Again, the Soviets invaded a Warsaw Pact member to stop an anti-communist revolution. The scale of death wasn't as great as in Hungary 12 years prior, but both events sent the same message: deviate from the Communist Party and you'll be invaded. But Gorbachev's reforms allowed for more open discussion, opening Pandora's box and unleashing political chaos. In the late 80s, the people of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union had a taste of freedom, and now they wanted more. Massive protests broke out behind the Iron Curtain. One of the biggest was the Baltic Way. On August 23, 1989, 2 million people linked arms across Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, forming a chain over 600 kilometers or 400 miles long. Incredibly impressive considering the total population of all three countries combined was around 8 million at the time. All across Eastern Europe in 1989, millions of people expressed frustration with their communist governments. The most dramatic moment was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Germany was divided between the East and West at the end of World War II, and the capital city Berlin, although located in East Germany, was divided as well. The Berlin Wall was first constructed in 1961, and it was upgraded over the years until the final version was completed by 1980. President Kennedy had visited the wall in 1963, publicly denouncing the Soviets' attempt to keep people from moving to the West. In 1987, with glasnost and perestroika underway, President Reagan visited the wall at Brandenburg Gate and delivered this famous speech.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In In August 1989, Hungary opened its borders with Austria. Thousands of East Germans, desperate to get to the west, traveled to Hungary to pass through Austria into West Germany. The East German government attempted to restrict travel again, triggering a huge protest in East Berlin on November 4th. A new draft of travel restrictions was drawn up as hundreds of refugees arrived at the West German embassy in Prague. The people had had enough. On November 9th, thousands of East Germans crowded the checkpoints along the Berlin Wall, demanding to be let through. The overwhelmed guards were given orders to let them through, and that night, for the first time in decades, East and West Germans were reunited. Official deconstruction of the wall began in June of 1990, but the people had already begun tearing it down themselves. This momentous occasion is often used to mark the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. There was a sense of hope and optimism as the first truly democratic elections since before World War II were held in the East. Despite the revolutions of 1989, the Soviet Union itself was still clinging to life, but that wouldn't last long. Back in 1979, the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan to try to ensure the survival of a new communist regime there. It turned into an absolute slog of a war. Much like how the Vietnam War became an unwinnable mess for the US, the Soviet-Afghan War likewise drained the resources of the USSR. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he immediately began planning for ending the war. Responsibility for the fighting was gradually shifted to the people of Afghanistan, and Soviet forces began withdrawing in 1987. By February 1989, Soviet forces were completely gone from Afghanistan. The US had supported the Mujahideen throughout the conflict, and since they were successful in forcing the Soviets out, the US gradually withdrew as well. The war was incredibly demoralizing for the Soviet Union. Massive sums of money were spent on this controversial war that the big, powerful Soviet army couldn't win. It hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union by turning more people against their government. What good was the Soviet government if it couldn't provide luxuries for its people and was also losing wars against weaker countries? With protests breaking out across Eastern Europe, a nuclear disaster and failed cover-up at Chernobyl in Ukraine, an unpopular war in Afghanistan draining the empire's resources, and the introduction of glasnost and perestroika, the Soviet Union began to collapse in 1989. The USSR was made up of smaller Soviet republics, with Russia being the largest. The Communist Party in Moscow had exercised control over the entire Union since its founding, but now the pieces began to break off. Estonia was the first Soviet republic to declare sovereignty in 1988, followed by Latvia and Lithuania, then Georgia and Azerbaijan. Lithuania declared full independence in March of 1990, and one by one every Soviet republic declared itself independent from the Union, including Russia. In June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of Russia amid a power struggle between the Soviet Union and Russia itself. Gorbachev wanted to sign a new union treaty that would convert the USSR into a loose federation of independent states with a common president and military. But in August, Gorbachev was placed under house arrest as several of his top officials conspired to overthrow him in a coup. The coup leaders tried to arrest Yeltsin as well, but failed. Fearing another coup, nearly all of the Soviet republics declared independence soon after. By November, Yeltsin had taken over most of what remained of the Soviet government, and he banned all Communist Party activity on Russian soil. On December 1st, Ukraine held a referendum in which over 90% of voters chose to leave the Soviet Union. A week later, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus secretly met to discuss the dissolution of the Soviet Union. On Christmas Day 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev officially announced the end of the Soviet Union. The Soviet flag was lowered and the Russian tricolor flag replaced it, signaling the end of the Cold War. Throughout Gorbachev's time as the head of the Soviet Union, relations with the US became more relaxed. In 1983, President Reagan gave a speech calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, as the US increased military spending and geared up for renewed Cold War tensions. But after Gorbachev came to power in 1985, Reagan dropped the evil empire label, recognizing Gorbachev's desire to reform the Soviet Union. In 1987, Gorbachev visited the US, and during the visit, he and Reagan signed the INF Treaty. This new agreement required both superpowers to permanently eliminate all nuclear missiles with ranges of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. From 1987 to 1991, nearly 2,700 nuclear missiles were destroyed. US-Soviet relations were cooling as the USSR began to collapse. With Black Ops 6 taking place in early 1991, there's one more major historical event to talk about before we jump into the campaign: the Persian Gulf War. Let's start with some context. Prior to World War I, modern-day Iraq and Kuwait were under the authority of the Ottoman Empire. Iraq became a British mandate until 1932, when it gained independence as the Kingdom of Iraq. Kuwait was a British protectorate after World War I, which lasted until 1961 when it became independent. In 1958, there was a coup in Iraq that overthrew King Faisal II, turning Iraq into a republic. In 1968, another coup in Iraq resulted in the rise of the Ba'ath Party, which believed in the formation of a unified Arab state under a socialist government. One member of this party was Saddam Hussein, who served as vice president of Iraq before rising to power as president in 1979. That year, Hussein purged the Ba'ath Party of anyone who wasn't loyal to him. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Hussein feared the influence of Iran within Iraq, and in 1980 he launched an invasion of Iran. The Iran-Iraq War lasted from 1980 to 1988, and controversially, the US supplied Iran with weapons, viewing Iran as the lesser of two evils compared to Saddam Hussein. After the war ended in 1988, Iraq had developed a significant debt to Kuwait, which the latter refused to waive. Furthermore, Kuwait refused to decrease its oil production, keeping oil prices low and further harming Iraq's economy. So on August 2, 1990, Saddam ordered an invasion of Kuwait. Within the first day, Iraq had control over the country. The UN placed sanctions on Iraq and established a deadline to withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. The US and the West were now concerned that with Saddam now in striking distance of Saudi Arabia's oil fields, he would now have control over the majority of the world's oil reserves. So the United States began Operation Desert Shield, sending thousands of US military personnel to Saudi Arabia at the request of King Fahd. As the military buildup took place in late 1990, the US worked to create a coalition of countries willing to help liberate Kuwait if Saddam didn't evacuate Kuwait by the January 15th deadline. Surprisingly, the Soviet Union condemned Iraq's actions and supported the US in forming the coalition. Their vocal support demonstrates the extent to which Cold War tensions had come to an end by 1990. The January 15th deadline came and went, so on the 17th, the US launched Operation Desert Storm. Offensive operations against Iraq began with one of the most intense aerial bombardments in history. For 42 days, the US-led coalition laid waste to Iraqi infrastructure and military targets. Operation Desert Storm saw the widespread use of precision-guided smart bombs for the first time, and with increased accuracy, the aerial bombing during Desert Storm was deadly and effective. One horrific moment of the war took place on February 26, 1991, when American attack jets blocked the front and rear of a column of Iraqi vehicles along Highway 80. Over 1,000 vehicles were trapped on the highway, and American bombers unleashed carnage on the Iraqis stuck on the road. This became known as the Highway of Death, and the pictures of the destruction are haunting to say the least. As the Iraqi military was forced out of Kuwait, they set hundreds of oil wells on fire, creating this hellish nightmare that we see depicted in the first mission of Black Ops 6. Within 2 days of crossing the Iraqi border, coalition forces had reached within 150 miles of Baghdad before falling back to the border with Kuwait as a ceasefire was negotiated. Saddam Hussein was allowed to stay in power, a move which President Bush was criticized for. Around 200,000 people were killed in the conflict, Iraq remained sanctioned, and the Iraqi people continued to suffer for years to come. American veterans of the Gulf War often developed something called Gulf War syndrome. This collection of symptoms involved chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal issues, and other nasty things. The Persian Gulf War is often seen as a prelude to the much more controversial 2003 invasion of Iraq, but that's a topic for another day. Now it's time to get into the campaign. The opening cutscene starts with some guns falling into a pile. I think it represents the end of the Cold War, showing that the US and the Soviet Union are no longer preparing to fight each other. It could also be alluding to the INF Treaty, which makes sense because in addition to seeing clips of the end of the Berlin Wall, we also hear President Reagan describing the INF Treaty. We see articles describing the end of the Cold War as Gorbachev pushes for reform. We see images of the burning oil fields in Kuwait and hear President Bush's voice describing Operation Desert Storm as the title drops. In this opening cutscene, we're also introduced to the main characters we'll be working with throughout the game: Troy Marshall, Jane Harrow, Savati Dumas, Felix Newman, and the legendary Frank Woods. The next scene shows a debrief between Daniel Livingston, who's the fictional deputy director of the CIA, and the team. Livingston is pissed. There was an op in Kuwait that went sideways due to the alleged interference of a multinational paramilitary force called Pantheon. Marshall retells the story. He was positioned along the Iraq-Kuwait border on January 23, 1991, right in the middle of Operation Desert Storm. The oil fields have been set on fire, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere. Overall, I was blown away by how good this game looked. The environments were so impressive. Marshall was joined on this mission by Harrow and Case, the character we'll be playing as. Our objective was to capture Saddam Hussein's defense minister, Saeed Alawi, before he could escape Iraq. We signal an Air Force pilot to trap Alawi by creating a traffic jam. Just like in the Highway of Death, they shoot targeted missiles at the front and the back of the convoy, giving Alawi nowhere to go. We push through the smoke, annihilating everyone in our path, and when we get to Alawi, he's confused, saying that he already had a deal with the CIA. Interesting. We see helicopters that, according to Marshall, belong to the mysterious Pantheon group. Harrow gives the order to stay and wait for backup, but Marshall decides to get Alawi out and escape Pantheon on our own. We fight through the Pantheon forces and escape with Alawi, but then we're surprised with the visitor. It's Russell Adler from Black Ops Cold War. He executes Alawi right in front of us, then gives himself up. Adler claims the CIA is compromised, and we take him into custody and turn him over to the CIA. Since the op went so poorly, our team gets suspended, but Harrow gets to keep her office. I love this bit from Livingston.
The Cold War is over. Mr. Woods. That makes you and Russell Adler the last global gunslingers of a bygone era.
Man, I love the references to history like that. It gives me chills. Marshall and Woods meet Harrow in her office. Woods tells Harrow that they're going to take a little trip and reflect. 3 days later, Marshall, Woods, and Case are in Bulgaria. Adler's message of Bishop takes Rook was referring to a secret abandoned KGB safe house in Bulgaria, so the team heads there to pick up the trail of Pantheon. Before Adler went missing, he was investigating them. Apparently, Pantheon was receiving orders from inside the CIA, but it got worse. They were developing a new bioweapon with plans to unleash it. Adler used the Rook as a safe house, and throughout the game, we'll do the same. Just like the safe house in Black Ops Cold War, the Rook serves as a hub where we can select missions, find secrets, and now we can level up our skills. In the main missions, we can find money to bring back to the Rook and spend it to buy upgrades. Our first lead that Adler left behind is Savati Dumas. We'll find her on the fictional island of Avalon, named after a mythical island from the legend of King Arthur. To earn Sev's trust, we're helping her get revenge on the Guild, a crime faction she used to be a part of. Our first target is this guy Yannick, who's on a yacht off the coast of the island. We can choose to go in guns blazing or take the stealthy approach. I choose the latter as best I can. Stealth has never been one of my strong suits in games, but anyways, eventually I get to the top of the church bell tower, grab the sniper rifle, and take aim at Yannick. His phone call confirms that the Pantheon and CIA are linked somehow, then I take the shot. Back on the streets, I link up with Sev. We take the getaway van to the Guild HQ on a mission to take out their leadership. I sneak through the kitchen and up the stairs where we meet Asadie, the head of the Guild. Sev and I chase him through the market and back to the streets where she finally gets her revenge. Since we helped her, she agrees to join our team. While we were in Avalon, Marshall went to Munich to bring Felix Neumann aboard the team as well. Neumann was a former Stasi enforcer, the secret police in East Germany. During the cutscene, we see an article referring to brain drain gutting East Germany. This term brain drain refers to the loss of highly skilled people who emigrate to other countries. Throughout the Cold War, talented scientists and technicians defected to the West to seek a better life. This was the main reason why the Berlin Wall was built in the first place, to keep valuable people like Felix Neumann locked in the East. Back at the Rook, I take a second to appreciate the gorgeous scenery before going inside to see Neumann. He tells us that Adler is being held in the CIA black site below Washington, D.C. We have to go rescue him. Access to the black site is secured by a retinal scan, so we'll need a high-quality photo of the fictional U.S. Senator Jack McKenna. In the cutscene, we see a newspaper referring to future President Bill Clinton's aspirations. Clinton would go on to defeat George H.W. Bush in the 1992 presidential election and win re-election in 1996. Clinton didn't announce his candidacy for the presidential election until October 1991, and this mission takes place in February, so the timeline's a little wonky. Ignoring the timeline issues, this mission was so fascinating because of the dialogue between the attendees of the gala. After running into Harrow at the entrance, I take a walk around the room listening in on conversations. This group talks about how Clinton seems so down to earth and relatable. Clinton's charisma was a massive asset to his campaign. He successfully charmed the Democratic Party into nominating him for president, and he won over moderate Americans with his third way approach to politics, appealing to conservatives and liberals alike. One guy argues that although Clinton is down to earth and relatable, he's missing the air of authority for a president. Another guy argues that Clinton would make a good president based on his record as governor of Arkansas, referring to education reforms put in place by Clinton. In 1983, he signed a law to raise taxes to better fund schools and require teacher competency tests in Arkansas. The first guy who was skeptical about Clinton then acquiesces that Clinton does support smaller government, maybe there's something to these new Democrats after all. Clinton moved the Democratic Party closer to the center, and these new Democrats push for policies that by today's standards would be seen as fairly conservative. Over at this table, the group is talking about the Naira testimony. This was a false testimony to Congress that took place in October 1990. A 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl named Naira Al-Saba testified about the alleged Iraqi theft of incubators from Kuwaiti hospitals, leaving babies to die. Turns out that Naira was the daughter of a Kuwaiti ambassador who wanted to drum up more support for the coalition against Iraq. This table talks about how they can't believe the Cold War is finally over. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the doctrine of MAD, or mutually assured destruction, prevented nuclear conflict between the US and the Soviets. If either side used a nuclear weapon, the other would retaliate in kind, so neither would risk using nukes. Although it prevented nuclear war, MAD resulted in widespread paranoia around the world, traumatizing entire generations with fears of nuclear apocalypse. This guy at the table says, "I've lived my whole life with it, the threat of nuclear war. Feels weird to be free of that." Another attendee says, "You can feel it in the air, can't you? We're standing on the precipice of a new world, and it's ours for the taking. It's all up from here." With all this optimism about the end of the Cold War, it really seemed like nothing but good times ahead. No wonder people have so much nostalgia for the 90s. If only it were that simple. As a history nerd, this was one of my favorite missions in the whole game. So many little references here and there. I didn't mention them all, so go see what else you can find. Finally joining Sev at a table, we see Senator McKenna standing on a stage speaking with the then Governor Bill Clinton. McKenna isn't giving interviews, so we'll have to find a sneaky way to get a high-res picture of him. I love how there are multiple ways to do this, it makes for some nice replayability. I decided to go for the covert affair option. Apparently McKenna's been cheating on his wife with an aide, so I sneak outside, grab the evidence of the affair, and give it to his wife in exchange for getting her husband to let me take a photo. After getting the photo, I sneak over to the rooftop, crawling past the guards and reuniting with Marshall and Sev. Marshall and I glide down the elevator shaft and make our way into the underground bunker, using the photo of McKenna to get access. But it looks like Pantheon beat us here. I sneak through the facility until we find Adler in this room. Back on the surface, we have this awesome escape section where we grab a couple of show motorcycles and slam them through the front door, followed by a ridiculously insane chase sequence where we barely escape. Back at the Rook, Russell Adler joins our team. Adler refers to a bioweapon called the Cradle, and we get triggered again just like at the beginning of the game. Our next mission sends us back to Iraq to locate the Cradle, which is supposed to be stored in a bunker under one of Saddam Hussein's palaces. The British want to bomb the palace, so Adler pulls strings with his old friend Helen Park, the same one from Black Ops Cold War, to get the British to delay their airstrike in exchange for some help with destroying some Scud missile launchers. In real life, throughout the Persian Gulf War, Iraq launched Scud missiles at Israel, Saudi Arabia, and American bases, resulting in the deaths of a few dozen Americans, Saudis, and Israelis. In this mission, we take out several Scud launchers in any order we want. It's a semi-open world mission which is pretty interesting to see in a COD game. We operate out of this base called the Layup where we can resupply and hop in a Humvee. It was pretty cool driving around and finding all the hidden stashes, though it did get a bit tedious after a while. Getting access to the attack helicopter and stealth bomber was pretty cool though. When you use the stealth bomber, you can use the precision-guided smart bombs that I referred to earlier. Nice little detail. The best part is that you can use the helicopter and stealth bomber on the next mission if you get them, which makes the assault in the palace a lot easier. The assault itself is a bombastic action movie of a mission. Nothing notable for the first part, except for these cool murals depicting Saddam Hussein as a heroic leader. I couldn't find out if these were real murals, but there are lots of real-life Iraqi murals similar to these. Down in the bunker we see a sample of the Cradle, and some documents linked to a Soviet scientist, Matvey Gusev. Gusev is a fictional character who is part of BioPreparat, the Soviet Union's real-life bioweapons agency. BioPreparat was massive, employing tens of thousands of Soviets in the creation of biological weapons such as anthrax, Black Death, smallpox, measles, and more. In 1979, there was a horrific outbreak of anthrax in Sverdlovsk, modern-day Yekaterinburg, where spores were accidentally released from a BioPreparat research facility. Although the Soviet government denied that it was a result of bioweapons research, this event was what tipped off the West that the Soviets had such an extensive bioweapons research agency. Back in the game, turns out the Cradle wasn't actually produced in Russia, but in the US, in a secret facility in Kentucky. We escape the bunker and hold off assaulting Iraqi forces until we get picked up. After a brief rest at the Rook, Marshall, Sev, and Case are off to Kentucky to infiltrate advanced technologies and applications. Adler worked there years ago, and apparently there was human experimentation going on. The place got shut down after what Sev and Marshall suspect was an accidental release of the Cradle. Entering the facility, we put on some gas masks, but after falling down an elevator shaft, Case's mask gets cracked and we're exposed to the Cradle. This is where the game goes from James Bond action movie to horror thriller. I had no idea what to expect from this game, but the last thing I thought was that they would incorporate zombies into the campaign. So apparently the Cradle is some kind of a hallucinogen, and Case is one of the human test subjects. To escape, I have to find 4 access keycards. Near the first one, I find a grappling hook. After defeating the first zombie boss, I run around collecting the other cards. My favorite one was this one, where the mannequins act like weeping angels from Doctor Who, only moving when you're not looking. The whispering voices in my head were so disturbing. I understand why some people wouldn't like this part of the campaign, because this is where any sense of grounding in reality gets lost, but as a fan of horror games, I actually liked this section a lot. It was unexpected and the atmosphere was very well done. Eventually I link back up with Marshall and Sev, and we find out that someone did steal a large batch of the Cradle. Things are escalating. Back at the Rook, Newman finished decrypting the disk we found at the bunker in Iraq. In another unexpected twist, we see that Harrow has been working with Pantheon this whole time. She was their contact in the CIA, which explains why she wanted to just wait for backup in the first mission. Now our goal is clear. We have to take out Pantheon. Adler was right, the CIA is compromised. Pantheon has been using laundered casino money to fund their research programs, so it's back to Avalon to follow the money. The next mission is a pretty standard heist operation that you'd expect from an action spy movie. It was enjoyable and the casino was gorgeous to explore, but at this point in the game there isn't really much connection to history. After a whole lot of sneaking around, playing poker, and hacking door codes, the team is in the basement near the safe boxes. In B-24 we find a dossier. There's a record of a wire transfer to a lab in Iraq, linked to Gusev. Adler investigated and found out that it's a setup. The trail of the Cradle is being deliberately set up to lead to Saddam Hussein. In real life, one of the United States' justifications for the 2003 invasion of Iraq was to eliminate Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program. This turned out to be false. Iraq's biological weapons factories were mostly destroyed after the Persian Gulf War in the mid-90s. It's little subtleties like this that really make me appreciate these games, even if they aren't as grounded in history as the older COD games. After hanging out with the team over some beers back at the Rook, our next mission takes us back to Kuwait, trying to track down Gusev before he can escape. Adler phoned in another friend from Black Ops Cold War. It's Lucas Sims. After the events of the last game, he decided to join the US Military Central Command rather than stay in the shadows with the CIA. Sims hooks us up with a favor, a massive assault force to take the pressure off of us as we look for Gusev. Fighting through the airport against stiff resistance, we board Gusev's plane and clear it, but we've been duped. Gusev is actually on the other side of the tarmac, so I hop in a tank and carve a path of destruction right through the airport. After blasting apart his actual plane, Gusev tells us that the cradle is being stored in Vorkuta, the old Soviet gulag that Alex Mason was locked in back in the early 60s. Vorkuta was a real Soviet gulag or labor camp, originally built in the 1930s during Stalin's reign over the USSR. Anyone who was found guilty of thought crimes like speaking out against the government, or if they were found guilty of a serious enough crime, would be sent to these labor camps. The camps were used to enslave their population, using them for construction or resource extraction. Millions of people were placed in these camps, often without any kind of a trial. The Vorkuta gulag was primarily used for coal mining. Mason and his friend Viktor Reznov participated in a massive uprising to escape the gulag. In real life, there was an uprising at Vorkuta in 1953. It began as a protest as laborers began a strike, but soon it turned violent, resulting in the deaths of dozens of workers as the camp guards restored order. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev began the process of de-Stalinization and dismantled the formal gulag system in 1960. Vorkuta was closed in 1962, but the practice of forced labor as a punishment continued throughout the Soviet Union's history and is still used in Russia today. Back in the game, Sev sneaks into the camp and disables its defenses, then gives the all-clear for the rest of the team to move in. On the security feeds, we see Harrow in the basement, so the plan changes. We fight our way through the basement to capture Harrow and bring her back to the Rook. One small note, I love how the walls are painted with this sickly turquoise color. If you grew up in the former Soviet Union, have ever been to a former Soviet country, or have seen travel videos from there, you know that for some reason this color was used in so many Soviet construction projects. Nice little attention to detail there. Back at the Rook, apparently Harrow had a tracking device implanted in her arm, so now Pantheon is coming after us. With time running out, Adler injects Harrow with a serum designed to separate Harrow's true self from her constructed personality. This part of the game gets really weird, so I'll just sum it up. Marshall interrogates Harrow in this drugged state to get the truth out of her. In the process, we revisit Harrow's memories of her parents' murders. Pantheon arrives during the interrogation, so we defend the house while Woods finishes up with Harrow. The evil fragment of Harrow wants to use the cradle on the US government so that Pantheon can take over the US as the Soviet Union collapses. She'll blame the attack on Saddam Hussein. Woods doesn't believe that the American public would buy into a false flag attack, but Harrow explains the power of confirmation bias. It's a lot easier to sell people on a lie if it confirms what they already want to believe. Throughout history, propagandists use confirmation bias to brainwash people into complicity with some of the worst ever violations of human rights. Now Harrow and Pantheon want to brainwash Americans into accepting their coup of the government. They've set up the cradle to be released at the Capitol building, getting Congress to go crazy and start killing each other. The separation serum wears off and evil Harrow returns. She's secured by Pantheon, so I rush to her helicopter to take her down once and for all. 2 weeks later, Marshall's team meets up with Livingston, who offers to bring them back into the CIA. Pantheon is still out there, and whoever got them inside the CIA in the first place is still at large. We see a man at a computer at Langley, and the credits roll. Black Ops 6 was an interesting campaign. Overall, I enjoyed it. The second half of the story got away from grounding in history, and the zombie stuff, while it was cool for the gameplay, really shifted the tone of the story. Regardless, I still had a lot of fun. The connections to history that were there were thought-provoking. So what did you think of Black Ops 6? Did you enjoy the campaign or were you disappointed? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something along the way. I want to give a massive thank you to all the people who've subscribed since I started making these history videos. I had no idea that we would reach 10,000 subscribers so quickly, and I'm super grateful for all the support. Thank you for all the nice comments, suggestions, and constructive criticism. If you're new and enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you for watching this far, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out for now.